HOA Karen burned my car, but she had no idea I'm a former federal prosecutor. I am John Davis, a former federal prosecutor, and I have spent more than 20 years of my life fighting organized crime in Los Angeles. Throughout my career, I investigated and handled countless cases involving gangs, money laundering, and major criminal operations. I can't count the number of times I had to face dangerous individuals, powerful players in society. Those days, my life was filled with tension, confrontations, and sometimes even life-threatening situations. But when I decided to retire in 2018, I realized I needed to find a peaceful life, away from the shadows of cases, gangs, and constant dangers. I no longer wanted to hear the sirens of police cars or urgent late-night calls. I simply wanted to find a peaceful place to start over, a place where I could enjoy the quiet I had longed for during all those years of work. After some time searching, I decided to move to Santa Monica, a well-known suburb of Los Angeles. It had well-maintained streets, beautiful homes, and fresh air, making it the perfect place for anyone who wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. On June 1st, 2020, I officially moved to Santa Monica, bringing with me hopes of a new life. On the very first day, everything went smoothly. A few new neighbors came by to greet me, bringing welcome baskets, warm congratulations, and stories about the community here. I felt as though I had found the perfect place to restart my life, a place without crime, without major issues, just peace and happiness. Only a month later, in mid-July 2020, I met Karen Foster for the first time, the president of the Santa Monica Homeowners Association. She was a middle-aged woman with a constant smile and a sophisticated appearance. At 7 a.m., just a day after I had moved in, Karen knocked on my door. "Welcome to Santa Monica," she said, her eyes cold and somewhat sharp. "I am Karen Foster, the president of the Homeowners Association. I brought you the documents to join the neighborhood council." When I looked at the documents, I saw more than 40 pages of regulations regarding monthly resident fees, community standards compliance requirements, from trimming trees to strict architectural guidelines. The fees seemed quite high, but I felt there was no reason to refuse. However, as I began to read more carefully, I sensed that something was wrong. The rules were too stringent, the fees unreasonable, and I couldn't agree to join right away. "Thank you, but I'm not interested in joining," I replied gently but firmly. Karen looked at me, her expression changing immediately. The smile on her face faded, and there was a strange tension in her voice. "I'm sure you don't understand. Here, everyone joins. If not, there will be problems." I didn't expect that refusing to join the HOA would lead to a series of unexpected events, a battle not only with an arrogant woman, but also with an entire system of power built over time. And I also didn't expect that, while I was seeking a peaceful life, I would unknowingly step into a battle of wits, where I would face an enemy who was not only dangerous, but also very cunning. Right after I refused to join the HOA, I began noticing strange changes around me. What started as small things, like criticisms of how I mowed the lawn or managed my front yard, gradually escalated into direct, purposeful actions. Karen Foster wasn't someone who easily gave up, and my refusal had sparked an unofficial, yet very intense battle. Just a week after I turned down the HOA, I began receiving strange notes on my door and car. These notes weren't just simple requests to comply with neighborhood regulations, they were filled with veiled threats. One of the notes read, "If you don't cooperate, we will do whatever it takes to maintain order here." At first, I didn't think of it as a direct threat, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was a message with hidden meaning, almost like a warning. Karen didn't stop at sending notes. She began targeting every small detail of my property management. She sent people to inspect everything around my house, from the lawn to the way I managed the outdoor lighting system. Each time there was even the smallest mistake, whether intentional or accidental, a violation notice would arrive. One of those notices was about a small street light I had installed in front of my door, deemed too bright and not in compliance with community standards. However, when I walked around the neighborhood, I saw that many other houses had similar lights, and some even had brighter ones than mine. But why was I being singled out? The answer was clear. Karen was trying to put pressure on me, but it didn't stop there. Karen continued with subtle yet calculated actions to make my life difficult. One time, after I parked my car in front of my house, I noticed a neighbor standing by the window, staring at me. A strange feeling of being watched spread through my body. The next day, when I left my house, I discovered a note on my car. Please park in accordance with the rules. At this point, I started to realize something. Karen didn't just want me to join the HOA. She wanted to control every move I made. The more time passed, the more I felt like I was being constantly watched. Not just by Karen, but by the people around me. Every step I took seemed to be under surveillance. Every decision I made was scrutinized. My neighbors, the same people who had once welcomed me with gift baskets, now avoided me. Whenever I ran into them, their gaze would quickly shift away, and they no longer initiated any conversation. This made me feel increasingly isolated and alone in my own home. What used to be outdoor parties or casual meetups with neighbors now felt like occasions for Karen to exert pressure on me, and of course, I was no longer invited. It didn't stop there. I began to notice a noticeable shift in the attitude of those around me. On the third week after I refused to join the HOA, I received a call from Tom Harris, one of the neighbors I had chatted with before. Tom was a friendly person, and I had helped him fix his car a few times. However, that call made me feel uncomfortable. "John, I just wanted to say, we're all part of a community, right?" Tom's voice sounded nervous. "Karen really cares about maintaining the rules here, and I just wanted to remind you that not joining the HOA could cause you some serious problems." The feeling I got from Tom's words was one of fear, as if he was speaking on Karen's behalf, as though he had been forced to advise me. At that moment, I realized that it wasn't just me, but the whole community was being affected by Karen and her group. Karen's control didn't just stop at HOA regulations. It had spread throughout the neighborhood, and anyone who dared to oppose her would face isolation and threats. I began to clearly understand that I wasn't just fighting an HOA board, but I was up against an underground power system, carefully constructed with complex relationships and manipulation I hadn't known existed. But I couldn't let myself be pushed into defeat. I knew I needed a strategy to deal with these retaliatory actions. I wasn't the kind of person to give up easily, and I wouldn't let Karen and the HOA board continue to manipulate my life like this. Karen's actions weren't just typical irritation from a powerful leader. They were a sign of something larger and more sophisticated. With over 20 years of experience as a prosecutor, I was used to picking up on the smallest signs to uncover the hidden truth behind actions. I wasn't scared. In fact, I grew increasingly vigilant. Karen's actions weren't just personal. They were clearly part of a well-thought-out strategy. Without worry or fear, I began gathering information and evidence from every angle. The first thing I did was install surveillance cameras around my house. I didn't rush into everything. I started with the smallest details. At first, I only recorded minor violations that Karen deliberately caused, such as her sneaking around measuring my property's fence at midnight. However, I sensed that these actions weren't enough. I needed to dig deeper into her behavior to get a broader perspective. One late evening, as I was sitting in the living room, I noticed a figure moving outside in the garden. The camera's light revealed it was Karen. But this time, she wasn't dressed in her usual formal attire. She was in dark, discreet clothing, as if she was up to something secretive. From my vantage point, I could see her measuring around my property with a measuring tool. This wasn't a random action. It was part of Karen's strategy to control every aspect of my actions. But I didn't react immediately, refusing to let anxiety cloud my judgment. Instead, I kept watching and documenting everything she did, with the patience of someone who had witnessed countless sophisticated tactics throughout my career. What I needed was solid evidence, not mere assumptions. I knew that with just one crucial piece of information, I could expose the entire truth. The next day, I continued observing and began conversations with neighbors I trusted. One of them, Tom Harris, was someone I had already gotten to know. When I started mentioning Karen and the strange things happening lately, Tom's attitude immediately shifted. His expression became wary, as if he was afraid of something. He glanced around before speaking. "John, I advise you to be careful. Karen isn't who you think she is. She doesn't just run the HOA, she runs an entire network. Though Tom didn't elaborate, I could sense the worry in his tone. As an investigator, I didn't let emotions or confusion cloud my perception. I started following the connections between Karen and others in the community. It became clear to me that her actions weren't random. She had carefully built a network of power, connecting local officials, contractors, and even a few people in the police force. Every action she took was purposeful, part of a long-term strategy. I even discovered crucial documents that Karen had accidentally left behind during a private meeting. They contained detailed records of the HOA's financial activities, with vague numbers and payments funneled into accounts with unclear origins. Step by step, I was uncovering the truth. Karen wasn't just running an HOA. She was manipulating finances, laundering money through fake contracts, and forcing residents to sell their homes at low prices, profiting from buying up these properties. This wasn't the manipulation of one person. It was a system, an organized operation. As a prosecutor who had dismantled complex criminal cases, I realized this was the moment to apply the investigative methods I had used to take down crime syndicates. I didn't rush into action. Instead, I continued to gather evidence, step by step, ensuring everything was done properly and with solid grounds. Karen couldn't understand that she was up against someone well-versed in these tactics. I wasn't going to let her continue manipulating my life and the lives of those around me. The pieces were gradually falling into place, and I felt confident that with patience and experience, I wouldn't just uncover the truth, but would bring Karen and her accomplices into the light. I knew that in this line of work, I couldn't rely on just one piece of evidence. So I began collecting documents, noting down every piece of information I could access. I reached out to residents in the neighborhood, those who had moved out or had connections to Karen, and asked them about any unusual transactions or strange events they had witnessed during their time living here. Though they didn't speak directly, the nervousness in their attitudes and the vague responses they gave were signs that what I was uncovering wasn't just speculation. One day, while reviewing old emails from Karen, which I had obtained from a trusted source, I discovered some shady connections between the HOA and city officials. These emails showed that Karen had contacted several people in the city government requesting support for neighborhood upgrade projects, which turned out to be ghost contracts used to embezzle money for personal gain. Payments were made for non-existent services, construction contracts that were never executed, and expenses with no receipts or documentation. Everything was legitimized with the signatures of officials who were supposed to protect the community's interests. One of the most eye-catching emails was an exchange between Karen and a senior official from the city's building department discussing how to modify records to allow companies connected to the HOA to secure repair and upgrade contracts, regardless of whether these companies met the necessary standards. Everything became clear. Karen wasn't just running a mafia-style HOA. She was using it as a front for large-scale money laundering with support from the city government. After confirming these relationships, I continued my investigation and began tracking other individuals in Karen's network. I identified several contractors and construction companies that Karen had tied herself to, along with local police officers she had influenced to force residents into complying with the unreasonable HOA regulations. This wasn't just about manipulating the people in the neighborhood. It was a comprehensive strategy with collaboration between those in power and external organizations. One of the most crucial pieces of surveillance I recorded was a secret meeting between Karen and one of the contractors she frequently worked with. The scene in the video clearly depicted an illegal exchange. The contractor handed Karen a thick envelope of cash, commission, for the contracts his company had secured through the intervention of the HOA and city officials. I didn't need to say more. With this video alone, Karen and her group would have no way to escape. With each piece of evidence I gathered, I grew more confident that it was time for the truth to come to light. I wasn't rushing, because I knew that to take down an organized crime operation like this, I needed to be 100% certain I could bring Karen and her accomplices to court with undeniable proof. I didn't just want to clear up the neighborhood. I wanted to bring justice where it rightfully belonged. In the following days, I continued to observe and meticulously document everything, while also starting to use the resources I had. I reached out to old colleagues in the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to share the information I had collected. I knew that once I had the full evidence, no one could fight against the truth, and Karen would have to face the consequences of her actions. Even though I had gathered enough evidence and everything seemed to be falling into place, Karen showed no signs of stopping. She wasn't the type of person to easily accept defeat, especially now that she realized I was beginning to uncover and expose her secrets. She was arrogant and would never accept rejection. Each day, her actions became more erratic and violent. That night, as I returned home after a long day of gathering information, I witnessed something I couldn't have imagined. My car, the old sedan I had since I first moved to Santa Monica, was ablaze in the parking lot. The flames were roaring, their red light reflecting across the quiet neighborhood I had once thought was safe. I stood frozen in place, unable to believe my eyes. In that moment, I realized that Karen wasn't just playing petty games anymore. She had escalated into a battle that could not be undone. I ran closer to the car, and as the light from the flames illuminated everything clearly, I saw a figure standing not far off, hidden behind a row of trees. It was Karen, and her hand was steady as she watched my car burn. She just stood there, observing, with no hint of concern. As I approached, she turned, flashing a cold, sinister smile. "Now you understand, don't you, John?" Karen's voice was filled with challenge. "This is what happens when people refuse to comply with the rules," she said, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction and arrogance. "I told you, no one refuses me without paying the price. You think you can play against me? You're not the first, and you certainly won't be the last." Her words didn't scare me. On the contrary, they only made me tougher. As a prosecutor, I had heard enough threats throughout my career. Karen's words were not strong enough to shake me. I just stood there watching the fiery glow on my car and then looked back at her. "You can't burn me, Karen. You don't understand that what you're doing is only making things worse," I said, my voice low and resolute. Karen didn't flinch. "Do you think I'm afraid?" she sneered, mocking me. "You didn't listen to me, and now you'll pay the price. But don't worry, I'll make sure you understand even better." In that moment, I realized that I had to be patient and strategic. While the anger surged within me, I couldn't act impulsively. I wasn't someone who worked based on emotion. I had to stick to my plan. With the experience of a prosecutor, I knew that people like Karen only lost when they had no place to hide, when the evidence against them was undeniable. I didn't rush to pull out my phone to call the police, even though everything needed to be handled properly. I took note of every detail, every word Karen said. I knew I couldn't just stand there and wait. What she had just done only confirmed that the time for action had come, but not recklessly. I wouldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. She thought she could make me scared, but I was too familiar with situations like this. "You've made a serious mistake," I said, calmer than ever. "You'll pay for this, but not with me. You'll pay with the very system you've been exploiting." Looking into Karen's eyes once more, I felt a sense of victory in my heart, but also knew that, no matter what, I needed to do this carefully and discreetly. I had a plan, and all I had to do now was stay steady with what I had already started. Things were gradually falling into place, and I wasn't going to let Karen's madness disrupt it. She was just a pawn in the game I had already mapped out, and in the end, I would be the one who won. It was time to expand the investigation, and I couldn't do it alone. While I could gather enough evidence to charge Karen by myself, crimes like corruption, threats, and organized criminal activities required an investigation with the support of agencies strong enough and authorized to do it properly. So I reached out to the FBI, to old colleagues from the industry, people I had worked with throughout my career. In our secret meetings, I presented the evidence I had collected, including videos of meetings between Karen and contractors, emails proving her interference in construction contracts, and suspicious payments from the HOA budget. This evidence didn't just prove corruption, it showed a criminal organization much bigger than I had imagined. Karen wasn't just the head of an HOA. She was behind a network of corruption, stretching from city officials to contractors, police officers, and construction companies. This was the foundation I needed to request help from the FBI. After presenting all the data, the FBI agreed to join the investigation. A team of professional investigators was sent to Santa Monica to begin collecting further evidence and strengthening the case file. We worked together to identify the connections between Karen and city officials. Through this, we uncovered a series of financial transactions between the HOA and construction companies with no legitimate paperwork. Over $2 million had been transferred from the HOA's funds to offshore accounts, and contracts were signed with companies owned by Karen and her associates, all showing signs of money laundering. One of the most significant pieces of evidence I discovered was a fake contract between the HOA and a construction company secretly run by Karen. This company had received over $750,000 for a neighborhood infrastructure upgrade project, yet no actual construction work had been carried out. The funds were transferred to a bank account in the Cayman Islands, a known destination for suspicious financial transactions. This was exactly what I needed, a solid piece of evidence to elevate the case, and the FBI began their involvement. We then continued to investigate the threats and violence that Karen had used against residents who dared to oppose her. One of the most serious cases was that of Alice Greenberg, an 83-year-old resident who was threatened by Karen and her group to force her to sell her home at a low price. Alice had been threatened with veiled references to being handled if she didn't agree to leave. I took Alice's testimony, and this became an important piece of the case. Her testimony clearly showed that Karen had used fear and intimidation to force residents to leave and sell their properties at a loss. Along with the FBI, we tracked the activities of Karen and her associates. We identified the accomplices in this case, including several city officials, contractors, and local police officers. One of the investigators discovered that through phone calls and emails, Karen had contacted Tom Miller, a city building department official, to ask for his help in changing building permit regulations, thereby clearing the way for her contracts to be approved without any obstacles. These emails proved that Karen had exploited her position to conduct illegal transactions amounting to millions of dollars. Each piece of evidence we gathered further strengthened the case against Karen and her team. After an important internal meeting with the FBI on August 25, 2020, we agreed to approach the case with a strong and coordinated strategy. I convinced the FBI to request arrest warrants for Karen and her associates. But it wasn't just Karen. We also planned to arrest the city officials and contractors involved, those who had enabled Karen to carry out her acts of corruption and organized crime. With the support of my former colleagues in the FBI and other investigative experts, we had been preparing for these raids over the past weeks. We knew that once the operation began, Karen and her team would have no chance of escaping their crimes. Every detail, every hour had been meticulously planned. We would not allow confusion or haste to ruin this opportunity. On the morning of October 5, 2020, at exactly 6 a.m., the FBI launched the raid on Karen's home. I stood in the control room, watching every move on the surveillance screens, feeling the tension in the air. The scenes of FBI agents storming Karen's house, ransacking rooms, and seizing documents and electronics containing crucial information only heightened the tension I was feeling. But I couldn't let emotions take over. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when everything would come to light. Alongside Karen's house, the FBI also raided the HOA office, which contained countless forged documents about suspicious transactions, baseless contracts, and offshore bank accounts that Karen had used to conduct her money laundering schemes. We seized incredibly important evidence, including emails, document copies, and meeting recordings between Karen and city officials she had manipulated. Furthermore, we also recovered video footage showing the financial exchanges between Karen and contractors, proving that corruption had been taking place over the years. One of the most crucial documents we found was a record of financial transactions transferring funds from the HOA account to bank accounts in the Netherlands and the Cayman Islands, amounting to over $3 million. These funds had been withdrawn and shared among Karen, her accomplices, and the involved officials. We also discovered that Karen had used these funds to finance political campaigns through close relationships with political donors. Everything had been carefully prepared, and by 9 a.m., all the evidence was gathered and handed over to the court. The trial began on October 15, 2020, and we were ready to present every piece of evidence, every detail of the network of corruption and organized crime that Karen had been running. In court, we presented all the evidence of Karen's wrongdoing. The videos, documents, and testimonies from those who had been threatened by her were all publicly shown. I also took the stand, detailing how Karen had used her power to manipulate residents and embezzle millions of dollars from the HOA fund. Testimonies from residents like Alice Greenberg, who had been forced by Karen to sell her house under threat, were an essential part of the case file. Importantly, as the trial progressed, Karen's accomplices could no longer hide their guilt. They began to turn on her, confessing to what they had done with her, further solidifying our position in the case. These testimonies provided additional confirmation of the threats and intimidation Karen had imposed on the community, from setting fire to the cars of non-compliant residents to forcing people to leave their homes under pressure. Finally, after 3 weeks of intense trial, on November 2nd, 2020, the court convicted Karen and the members of the HOA. Karen was sentenced to 15 years in prison for charges of corruption, money laundering, organized crime, and violent threats. Her accomplices received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement. The city officials implicated in the case also faced corruption charges and were removed from their positions. When Karen and her team were convicted, the community of Santa Monica began to change. The residents, who had previously lived in fear, enduring manipulation and threats from the HOA, now regained their freedom and peace. There were no more walls between the residents, no more divisions. They were no longer controlled, but had become true friends. No one was isolated or avoided when interacting. Every conversation, every meeting was filled with respect and trust. The people of Santa Monica came together to rebuild their community. They began holding meetings, but this time not to discuss harsh regulations or enforce power, but to share ideas, plan for the future, and create a peaceful environment where everyone could live together in cooperation and unity. Neighbors who had once been strangers no longer felt doubt. Together, they repaired not only their homes, but also their relationships, healing the wounds left by past oppression. The neighborhood had truly changed, not just materially, but spiritually. Mornings no longer echoed with arguments, and afternoons were no longer filled with avoidance. It all began with unity, with a shared determination to rebuild trust among neighbors. With the fear of manipulation gone, the community had regained its inherent peace, and from there, they came to understand the true value of a united community. For me, the lesson I learned was not just about winning in a legal battle, but about the unbeatable power of resilience and unity. The most important thing I learned is never let manipulation and control take over your life. From the very first days of this fight, I knew that as long as we didn't give up and didn't submit, we would have the chance to change everything. Persistence and determination are the keys to confronting injustice. Justice may come late, but as long as we are patient and don't give up, it will ultimately prevail. Throughout this process, I have seen clearly that nothing is impossible if we stand firm and fight for what is right. I have witnessed these residents regain their freedom, trust, and most importantly, unity. When people come together, nothing can stop positive change. The greatest lesson I've learned is the power of community. When people rise up together, they can push back against all forms of corruption and violence. No manipulation can last long when people unite for a common goal. And it is this unity, determination, and faith in justice that helped this neighborhood overcome its greatest challenge. I know that when a community is united, nothing is impossible.